All right, ladies and gentlemen, a little bit of Johnny Cash there taking us into the top of the hour. It is 7 o'clock. Got an interview scheduled tonight. I'm very happy to have Robert B. Robeson on the line. And a little bit of background before I open up Bob's mic. Bob flew 987 combat medical evacuation missions in South Vietnam. This is 1969 we're talking about through 1970. He evacuated 2,533 patients from all sides of the action. He had 7 helicopters shot up by enemy fire and was twice shot down. He's a writer now. He's been published in over 750 times in 130 countries. Some of the places he's been published: Reader's Digest, Positive Living, Vietnam Combat, Writer's Digest, and Newsday. And, a funny thing is I've got a framed article that Bob wrote in Newsday from 30 or 40 years ago, and I just decided to track him down, and I'm lucky enough that Bob agreed to an interview. He's now retired from the U.S. Army. He retired as a lieutenant colonel after 27 and a half years of military service on 3 different continents. And hey, Bob, I'm opening up your mic. I want to thank you and welcome you on the air tonight.
It's nice to be here.
I tell you what, I guess maybe we should just start out with a little bit of background about you, where you grew up, what you're about.
Yeah, well, I guess you could say that I suffer from what you'd call an acute sense of unforgetfulness about Vietnam and how I got there. It all started when I was about 6 years old. I was the second son of a small-town Protestant minister in 1948 in Truesdale, Iowa, which is not that far from where you guys are.
Right.
I was one of those infamous preacher's kids, I guess you could say. This was a sleepy little town of about 125 souls, and it's located in the northwestern corner of the Hawkeye State. And my early dreams, I had 3 of them. I can remember when I was 6 years old. They were to be a pilot, a military officer, and a writer. Now, some might believe that I was too young to have such definite goals, but they'd be wrong. I recalled a traumatic event that happened the previous year when I was 5. What happened, my parents had left me with a farm family so they could attend a ministerial convention in another state. And while they were gone, this man took me to the top of a tall building in Storm Lake, which was about 7 miles away, to see the view. They just built this building, and it was the tallest building in the area. So he took me to the top of this building, and they had a 4-foot wall encircling the roof. And he had picked me up, my legs dangling over the edge, and then he pretended to push me off, with these fake shoves while he held me around the waist.
Wow.
And I remember to this day I began crying, and I fought to get down, and I don't think he was ever aware of how his prank terrified me. And from that moment, I had an intense fear of heights. I kept this secret from everyone. I didn't even tell my parents, and later I told it to my wife when I was over 50 years of age. Growing older, I continued to dream about being an adventurous aviator. I still had that desire to defy gravity and leap tall buildings with a single bound and explore cloud canyons, like Superman of that era. And the private pilot of a yellow single-engine plane often flew over our parsonage in Truesdale. And maybe this was one of the primary factors in the order of those 3 adolescent dreams. But even then, I still believed that I couldn't be a pilot and be afraid of heights. So it kind of remained a fantasy. And one Sunday when I was a junior in high school, we moved to La Grande, Oregon. Dad preached a sermon about Moses, and he mentioned that when God informed Moses he'd chosen him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, Moses had asked God, he actually asked him a number of times to send someone else because he had a speech impediment, and he didn't feel he could speak well enough to confront the Egyptian Pharaoh. But in Exodus, God told Moses, "Go and I'll be with your mouth and teach you what to say." And I remember, as a teenager listening to this biblical story, I realized that some people are overwhelmed by their fears while others are challenged by them. And that's when I began believing that there might be a job for me to accomplish somewhere in aviation. When I was 17, I enlisted in the LeGrand hometown Oregon Army National Guard Infantry Unit as a medic, and this was located just one block from our parsonage. Then I went through my 6-month infantry basic training in Fort Ord, California, and medic training in Fort Sam Houston, Texas in 1960 and early 1961. And this was during the draft era. In April 1965, I graduated from the U.S. Army Infantry Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning, Georgia. And then 4 months later, as a second lieutenant platoon leader, my San Jose Infantry Unit was activated for 6 days by the California governor during the Watch Ride in Los Angeles. And that was my first introduction to real heavy violence and destruction on a scale that was unprecedented. I think there were 34 people dead that week. There was over 1,000 injured, and something like 4,000 others had been arrested. And the damage across, like 50 square miles in South Los Angeles was about $40 million in that era's dollars amount. 1 year later, our unit was activated again for 3 days for the Hunters Point Ride in San Francisco. Then, with the conflict in Vietnam beginning to heat up in 1967, I felt that becoming a medical evacuation helicopter pilot was something I should do. And for some unknown reason, this seemed to be the aviation opportunity I'd been seeking. It would not only be my way of becoming involved in the war effort and maybe helping to save lives, but as a supposed non-combatant, but it's also what I felt compelled to do and attempt to overcome my fear of heights. My family wasn't pleased with this decision. Dad had not ever wanted me to enlist in the military. When I asked him to sign my enlistment papers when I was 17, about a month before high school graduation, he'd wanted me to be a minister like him, my uncle, and my brother. He'd never been in service and had no personal reference point or experience in this regard. But he eventually relented grudgingly because I blackmailed him. I told him, I says, well, you want me to go to college? If you don't sign this paperwork, I'm going to join the regular army when I'm 18, which was about 3 months then. And I said, it'll be 6 years after my enlistment before I can go to college. So he saw better of it and signed the paperwork. Then, while I was waiting for my orders to flight school in 1968, I left California and I returned to Oregon to visit my parents in LeGrand. And my only sibling, a brother who was 4 years older than me, he was about to leave to be a missionary to Nicaragua. And one day, he was pastoring in a town not too far away, and one day he drove over and he to see me, and we hadn't seen each other for a whole lot of years. And I remember we stood in the middle of our parents' living room, and he asked me what I intended to do. And I told him I was waiting for helicopter flight school orders, and after graduating from this 10-month course at Fort Walters, Texas, and Hunter Army Airfield, Savannah, Georgia, I intended to volunteer to be a medevac pilot in Vietnam. And to this day, I'll never forget his positive and encouraging words. "You're crazy," he told me. Well, I told him, I said, I guess I am crazy because that's exactly what I'm going to do. And I knew even then that the only opinion about my goals and dreams that counted was mine. And negative comments from anyone else only reflected their limitations. And he passed away at 60. My dad at over 91, and my mom at 95 and a half, which left me as the only family orphan, I guess. At the moment I'd signed my flight school paperwork, I vowed to myself that this fear wasn't going to rule or dictate my future. And the 1 hour orientation flight that day in a flimsy-looking open-door OH-23D observation helicopter at at Fort Walters in 1968. It was kind of an unnerving experience for me, to say the least. But I believe that people who win battles of the mind and spirit must first have a dream or vision of what's required for success. And by motivating oneself to move in that direction, I believe the person can provide a realistic way of helping to make that dream become a reality.
You wouldn't think somebody with a fear of heights would wind up flying helicopters.
Oh, I met a lot of people, a lot of crew members later told me that they were afraid of heights too.
Is that right?
Yeah. On March 25th, 1969, I graduated from Hunter Army Field as an Army aviator, and I had an instrument rating. And then I'd already volunteered for combat duty, so I was at the right place at the right time and the right age and with the right skills. And before 3 additional months had gone by, I'd married my fiancée, had been relocated 10,000 miles from home to my first aviation assignment with the 236 Medical Detachment, which was stationed at Red Beach on the shore of Da Nang Harbor in Da Nang, South Vietnam. And looking back, I believe those 2,500 patients I helped evacuate were probably thankful that I made that decision and didn't listen or become intimidated by what others thought, even if they were concerned for my safety. And maybe my brother was right with his 2-word commentary, though, because some of the exploits my fellow dust-off pilots accomplished in Nam probably did seem crazy to those who weren't there. But we were our brothers' keepers, though, and a lot of them were counting on us, and their morale and lives depended on our crews being able to get in and get out with them.
Couple quick questions, Bob. How difficult is a helicopter to master? I just have it in my head that it's incredibly difficult.
Well, it's harder than flying a fixed wing. I flew a few hours in Cessna 140 when I was in the medic school, and it takes about 13 hours to solo, roughly, average, and a couple of hours to learn how to hover. And you've got 3 different things you have to think about, whereas in an aircraft you have normally 2. You have the steering wheel, and then you have the pedals, and in the helicopter you have a collective that you pull up and you go up and you push it down and you go down, and then you have the cyclic, which is like the steering wheel of a helicopter, and then you have the pedals on top of that. So there's a lot of coordination, but the main thing you learn when you get in the thing, and you see guys, first couple hours, they'd be all over the sky, the instructors would be going crazy. But the whole idea was small movements. The smaller movements you made, the less things that can go wrong. And it just took a few hours to get to that point to where you could actually control the thing. But it was for me. I didn't have any problem. I soloed after 13 hours, and I'd been an athlete, in high school and college, so I had coordination. But it was just the psychological aspect, in your mind that you had to deal with. And usually you were so busy looking at the instruments and trying to figure out what was going on in the cockpit that you didn't look outside and see you were a long ways off the ground to begin with. It's easier.
You always flew the Huey, right?
Yeah, I flew the Huey, and like I said, we started out with the OH-23s, and then I flew the H-13, and then we got into the Hueys. The one we flew in Vietnam was the H model. Usually they'd have the slicks, and the gunships would have the C models and the D models, but the H models was the newest one out, and they always gave us preference, with a good aircraft. And it was a joy to fly. After you flew one of the smaller aircraft, it was like going from a Model T to a Cadillac.
I guess I always thought any medevac was considered a slick, but is that wrong?
No, slicks are the troop carrying.
Okay.
Yeah. That's what we called it.
And that's an incredible amount of missions. 987 in what time span?
A little less than a year.
Wow, that is an incredible amount of missions.
Well, in a year, it was probably just a little bit over average. We had people that did 2 and 3 tours, and they could really racked up, some miles. But that my year, it was just 900 and some.
All out of Red Beach near Da Nang?
Yeah, we flew out of there, and it was kind of neat. It was kind of neat. It was a great location for us. But the whole thing about all this, the first thing you learn when you get there, and this is the veteran pilots teach you that it's not about you. It's about the guys on the ground. And most people don't realize. Yeah, you get a lot of these chopper jockeys and jet jockeys and fast movers. They get all the headlines and everything. But it's the grunts on the ground. And when you say grunt to an infantryman, and you're a pilot, it's not a negative, it's a positive. These guys, they did the hardest work of anybody else there, and what they had to put up was just outrageous. What they had to do as these young kids. And so what we did as pilots was, our mission was to save as many of them as we could, and you were just always picking up bodies and dead and alive, and your mission was to get there. And what I always did in my mind psychologically, I would say, the only way you're going to keep me out of this LZ or getting those guys, or you're going to have to kill me. And with that kind of motivation, sometimes you don't realize what you're capable of doing. And the other thing was, when I was really scared and it was bad and they were saying it was insecure and people were getting blown away and everything, I would say, in my mind, I'd say, what if that was my wife down there? How would I act? How would I go in? How would I feel about it?
Boy, that's a pretty good way to frame it.
That spurred me on, and I didn't know any of these guys, but they had parents too, and they had friends, and they had wives and everything like that, and they were counting on us, and the military experience and looking out for each other. Yeah, we joked about the Marines, and we called them names, and they called us names, and both Marines and the Army hated the Air Force. But I tell you what, when those fast movers came in and they dropped down that heavy stuff, you realized that you were all in it together. So that's what it was all about. It was about the guys on the ground.
In that year that you were there, you were shot up 7 times and shot down twice. Would you like to talk about some of these missions?
Well, yeah, there are 7 or 8 when you talk about that many that really stand out, and one of them was it was in September of 1969, I believe, and we got this call, and John Ball was the aircraft commander. I'd only been in country about a month and a half, and I was still what we called a Peter pilot. You were the co-pilot. And so we got this mission after I'd been scheduled this for 5 days in September as John's co-pilot. So it was located at our field site, which is about 25 miles south of Da Nang along Highway 1, and that was Vietnam's main north-south highway. So we got this mission, and we took off. It was the 11th of September, and the infantry units that we were covering, and we covered everybody. We covered Australian guys. We covered South Korean guys, and ARVNs, which is the Army of Vietnam, Republic of Vietnam, and civilians. So we had our hands full. But anyway, on the 11th of September, they really nailed some of our units. And this was not the Viet Cong, the local guys. This was the North Vietnam Army, and these were the real fighters. And so on the 11th, we had so many missions. We were in the air, I think it was 11 hours, and then the next day was the 12th. We were in the air 10 hours, and you would go from one, sometimes you would just call ahead and have them bring food out to your aircraft, and when you land, drop off the patients, they'd give you plates of food, and one guy would fly while the other guy ate, and then the other guy would fly and you would eat. So that's how it went. And then on the third day, we'd only flown we'd flown 3 hours before the sun came up on the 13th, and we shut down, hoped that we'd get a little bit of sleep, and not too long, but got 2 hours later, I think, a mission was called in, and it was another hot, insecure LZ, they said, under heavy enemy fire. I called the gunship support from the Firebirds, and we had this gunship company that was right there with us at LZ Baldy. They're called the Firebirds, and so John landed and unloaded the load of patients we had, and we lifted it off again and went to try to get these 4 Americans who'd been seriously wounded by small arms. And as we were going, the co-pilot usually runs the radios, and I'd been there long enough where they could trust me to do it by myself. So I had this eerie sensation that had crept over me as we took off, and for some reason I knew that I was going to be tested like I'd never been tested before. I don't know what it was. It was just a feeling I had. And so when we got towards this area, it was about, a couple of clicks away from LZ Center, which is a very tall mountain, and had an artillery base on the top. And I could see that the artillery had been going into this surrounding terrain, and it was really concentrated. But then we called and talked to the ground unit, and they cut off the artillery so that we could go in. And we had the guns make a couple gun runs ahead of us to try to keep their heads down. And so John started his approach, and we went in, and what happened was John was a strange pilot. He was the only one I ever knew that he flew the aircraft like he was driving a truck. And most pilots, would put their elbow on their knee and hold cyclics. He wouldn't do that. He'd grab the cyclic and hold it out in front of him, and his elbow wouldn't touch his knee. I never did understand how he could fly like that. Huh. But that's what he did. So he never flew with the force trim on. And in a helicopter, there's an on and off switch that's located between the two pilots at the top of the pedestal. And, it's right beneath the instrument panel. And when that switch is on, there's an artificial feel or a force that's applied to the cyclic, which held it in one position. And you could move the cyclic, which is the steering wheel of the aircraft. You could hold the cyclic against this force, but if you release the pressure, the cyclic could return to its last trim position. And there was an intermittent force trim release button on the cyclic stick grip that, if depressed and held, it released the force trim pressure. So this is how John trimmed the aircraft, through the use of the button on the cyclic stick. So there was always aft pressure on the cyclic. And the reason he did this was because if he took a round or his hand came off the cyclic stick, it would the aircraft's nose would go up and gives the co-pilot a chance to take over the aircraft. And when you're barreling along at nearly 140 miles an hour, a couple feet above the ground, and people are shooting at you, that extra split second of time is important. And like we used to say, it could be the difference between survival or becoming a messy Huey sandwich, in a rice paddy or some hover hole in the jungle. I never flew with force trim on because it cost me to lose touch on the cyclic. But John just chose to do that, and because he did, there was a message that came about at that time that kind of went straight to my heart. There were tall trees along the edge of the LZ where our patients were located, and that formed an inverted V. And to get close to them, our patients, in the least amount of time, John had to make the approach and put our nose in the tightest part of this V. And it was because the LZ was so tight, we couldn't turn around to go out the way we come in for fear of hitting someone or something with our tail rotor, that he made the decision that he did. He told me, he says, Bob, I'm going to do a max performance takeoff up over the tree line. And this was hiding the bad guys, this tree line. So as we topped the trees, and they were about 75 feet tall, AK-47s, and these were Soviet assault rifles that the NVA used, and some other automatic weapons, hosed us down from just beneath and to both sides of the aircraft. And I can close my eyes anytime, and I can just bring that scene back of what happened and how I felt. And within that split second of time, for the next minute or so, everything seemed to occur in super slow motion. John said, my God, we're going to crash. And he says, my cyclic's been shot away. And I immediately looked over, and he was sweeping his cyclic stick in wide circles around the cockpit. And this kind of movement should have made the aircraft spin in circles, but nothing was happening. Our nose tipped over and began to dive toward the tree, so I instinctively reached over and grabbed my set of controls, and I said, I've got it. And then I thought to myself, this is it. Today I'm going to die. And that's when I couldn't hear the automatic weapons anymore because we'd flown out of the enemy's field of fire. As soon as I grasped my cyclic, it was immediately evident that the force trim pressure was no longer there. I looked at the switch, and it was on, but it had zero effect. And that's when, kind of a sixth sense, and to this day, I believe, this inner whisper that I believe came from God. It impressed me to be very careful and not move my cyclic more than necessary to stay out of the tops of the trees. And our skids were now, just brushing the tops of these big trees. So I eased the cyclic toward me, and we began a shallow ascent. And at that moment, the red RPM warning light on the instrument panel illuminated, and this thing, you can't believe it. It's like a fire alarm. It's gut-wrenching shrieks, came in our flight helmets from the low RPM audio warning. And then the next thing that came on was a yellow master caution light at the top of the instrument panel. And I looked down at the instrument panel on the pedestal between us, and I saw that the engine oil light was illuminated. So this meant that, we'd taken around in the engine or in the oil line somewhere. And, dust-off pilots, we set our normal engine RPM between 6,400 and 6,600 on missions, and the reason John and I flew at 6,400 was because it gave us 200 RPM to play with when you were on a hot descent where it could quickly build and possibly overspeed the engine if we weren't careful. So I looked down, and ours had bled off to nearly 5,800 RPM in just a few seconds. And I knew that if something didn't happen fast, our bird would soon have more characteristics of a crowbar than a crow. And we'd obviously been hit in the engine and oil lines, among other places, and John had been grazed in his left leg by a round. But he reached over to the pedestal, he placed the governor switch in the emergency position. And this provided enough extra engine power to momentarily remain airborne while we decided between the two of us what we were going to do. We realized immediately that our engine was losing a lot of oil, and it could seize. And if it did, I'd have to auto-rotate, and this meant that I'd have to descend on the energy in the blades alone rather than the engine to make a forced landing. And this would mean that I'd have to make a dramatic movement with my cyclic stick at the bottom to flare and to dissipate airspeed before the touchdown, even if I found an open area. Otherwise, I'd have to make a tree landing. So things were getting a little hairy in a hurry. I turned to John and said, "What do you want me to do?" And I'd already inched up to about 500 feet above ground level, and I had about a 80-knot indicated airspeed. And he says, "Just keep us in the air, just fly, and maybe we can find a place to put it down where we won't hurt ourselves." And if our engine failed, what I wanted was to make a running landing somewhere, but we were over the jungle, so that wasn't going to happen. And I realized LZ Ross was straight ahead of us. It was located in relatively flat terrain, and it had a large open area where we often picked up patients. But this was like 4 to 5 minutes away. So I told John, I said, "I'm going to shoot for Ross." And he said, "Okay, I'll call Da Nang and have him get another bird out there to pick us up." And that's when Bill Bergman, who was our crew chief, broke in on the intercom. He says, "We got our guns at 4 o'clock high. It looks like they're following us in." So John got on the radio and he called the Firebirds, and one of them told them what was going on, and one of them got underneath our aircraft, and he confirmed that he said we were leaking oil all over the sky. And I remember I did some silent praying en route too, and to this day I remember the exact prayer. I said, "God, you can make it difficult." But, excuse me.
No problem.
I said, "God, you can make it difficult, but please don't make it impossible." And it was shortly after this prayer that this soothing sensation, just oozed throughout my body. I've been sweating like a marathoner in the heat and the stress, but at that precise moment, this cooling sense of well-being swept over me, and I just accepted it as a confirming sign from God that we're going to make it, and hopefully without hurting ourselves. So about that time, I headed into a shallow and straight-in, long final approach for this large open area at Ross. And in the distance, I could see our flag on a tall flagpole to the north, atop a small ridge, and it was fluttering in the breeze. And I don't know how far away I was at that time, but it had never looked so good to me as it did at that moment. And I bounced our skids a couple of times on the uneven ground in a short running landing, and when the ground run stopped, so did our Lycoming Genetia. All 11 horses died at once. And I remember John and I turned to look at each other, and neither of us said a word because we both realized what had just happened. So he got out to check the battle damage, and I climbed down and stepped around to the cargo doors, which we always kept open, so it's easier to get the patients in and out. And on my side of the aircraft, where the patients were lying, and to see how they were doing. And most of the cargo door windows had been shot up, but because Tom Franks, our medic, had kept everyone lying on the deck, none had been wounded again. So I looked at this guy. I said, "Are you okay?" And he's a black non-commissioned officer, and he was struggling to sit up. And I reached up, put my hand on his shoulder, and he grabbed my hand between both of his, and he squeezed really hard. He says, "You guys are something else." And he said it in the soft southern accent, "Thanks, sir, for getting us out." And that something that you remember for a long time, because normally you didn't interact with the patients. You picked them up, you dropped them off, and you didn't really interact unless you went in to the aid station later to help them with the patients if they had too many to work on at one time. So we moved our patients to the Firebird gunships, and they flew them to the aid station at Baldy. And then John and I did a post-flight inspection, and we walked around the aircraft and confirmed that all the engine oil was gone. And the last of it, there was two small pools of oil in the clay beneath our aircraft. And so we stood next to the tail boom out of the sun in the shadow of this downed bird, and there was a long moment of silence. And I remember John looked at me, he cleared his throat, and then he stared into the distance. He said, "Somebody else was flying with us today."
I'll tell you. You saw an awful lot of death and destruction while you were over there.
I just nodded my head. There was never a doubt about that in my mind. And it was a few hours later before actually knew the rest of the story. Like Paul Harvey would say, after our maintenance crew arrived, they sling-loaded the bird back to Red Beach in Da Nang, and they hoisted it out beneath a big Marine CH-53 helicopter. And one of them took me aside. He told me he'd reached up and merely touched my cyclic stick, and it had broken off in his hand. And what had happened, they removed the metal floor paneling, and they took apart the controls, and they discovered that there was only a sliver of metal holding my cyclic in place. And that's why I couldn't feel any force trim pressure, against my hand. One of the bursts of automatic weapons fire from John's side of the aircraft had completely severed his cyclic stick, and it continued its flight, beneath the floor panels to nearly take mine out with it. And so, that soft inner voice that I'd heard when all this started was right on target. And even today, I believe God or one of his guardian angels warned me not to move my cyclic any more than necessary. And they kept that wounded bird flying for over 5 minutes, with no oil in the engine. And, if you believe in miracles, then this one was extraordinary. And like I told some people, if you don't believe such things occur, it really doesn't matter. You weren't there and I was.
Yeah, like they say too, there's not too many atheists in a war zone.
Yeah, that's true. So that was that was one of the unique ones. I mean, there were a lot of others, but that one particularly was unique because we found out everything after the fact. You didn't know what was happening. You knew that the engine had been hit. You knew the oil lines had been hit. You knew John was hit, but you didn't know how bad the cyclic problem was. And if my cyclic had broken off in flight, we're dead. There's no way. You don't have any way to fly that aircraft. You're just going down. So
you were within a sliver.
Yeah, just a sliver. Just a sliver. It's one of those unique experiences,
Bob, do all these missions and things like this, did you have issues with post-traumatic stress issues when you came back?
Not really. Not like we're seeing from maybe the guys in Iraq and Afghanistan, because a lot of them, 2, 3, 4, 5 tours. I think my religious beliefs helped me a little bit. There were times after we got back, I did have a series of nightmares. I'd wake up, and one night I scared the life out of my wife. I woke up and I said, "I'm going to kill you," and it was a dream about being shot down, And this happened for a period of time, not a long time, but it's been quite a while since I've had a nightmare about Vietnam. So I got off easy compared to a lot of other guys.
Well,
but it's just the intenseness of it. People don't realize how intense it is. You're not only worried about flying, you're going 140 miles an hour, a couple feet off the ground, people are shooting at you, and you got people dying that you're trying to get out, and you got 18, 19-year-old crew members that don't want to die, and they hope you know what you're doing, and that you don't wrap it up in the local scenery somewhere. So, you got all these things going on in your mind at the same time, and you're talking on 3 radios. You got, you're talking to the ground unit, you're talking to the gunships, you're talking to the aid station, and you're just switching back and forth between these things, and you have so many things going on. It's just, sometimes it seems overwhelming. But the longer you're there, the easier it is to deal with. It just becomes a matter of fact. You know you got a grid coordinate. You got to go there. But when you've been there and you've gone through a number of things like this, you're more at ease, and you can look out and check the terrain, and they'll tell you where the last fire came from, and you have to, as you're doing all these other things, you have to plan your approach. So you don't want to fly over the bad guys, and you don't want to run into a tree, and so it takes a little coordination, and is your mind, you kind of train your mind to do these things. And, the guys that have been there and been involved in it, they understand what I'm talking about. Most people probably don't. But I'm telling you what, it's intense. It's really intense because it wasn't me so much I was worried about. You got people dying down there, and they're a lot worse off than you are. So that's where your focus was. You wanted to get in, get out, and get them to an aid station or hospital, and without losing any of your own guys.
Bob, before we go any farther here, you want to take a break? Are you good?
I'm good.
Okay. I know that there was a big mission written up in a newspaper in Germany. You want to touch on that mission?
Yeah, that was what had happened was I happened to be on duty, flight duty. It was a Sunday, 7th of March, 1970, and I'd gone to chapel service and I'd come back at Eton, and it was really slow. There wasn't much happening on that day. So this German reporter, and he had a Marine bodyguard, and he had a photographer with him, and they drove in a Jeep, and he walks up to me. He's a little short, bald-headed guy, and he says, I've got clearance from the highest authority, he says, to come visit you and to go on a mission with you. And I told him, I said, well, I said, it's been really slow around here. I don't know if there's going to be anything to do. And he said, oh, I'll hang around. And he told me while we were talking, he said he had been on a bombing mission with the vice president of Vietnam, Key, and he'd also been on a night ambush mission with the Special Forces. And so he was telling me all these experiences. He said, I've been a reporter in many wars, and so I think he was trying to make me not be that concerned about him, that he'd been around he'd been around for a while. So I said, okay, well, we'll just wait and see what happens. And it wasn't an hour later. It was like a 1:30 in the afternoon. The operations specialist came to my hooch, and he told me, he said that a full colonel wanted to talk to me on the phone. And when I got on the phone, this colonel told me, he says, there was a U.S. infantry company that was in heavy contact about 40 kilometers away in the northwest towards Laos. And he said, they're surrounded by what we think is a battalion of the big guys, NVA, and he says the Americans have wounded and captured one of their officers, and he says we need to get him out of there because unless we get him out, he's going to die. I'm a captain. He's a full colonel, and I was born at night, but I wasn't born the night before, so I knew that he wasn't probably concerned that much about the guy's physical problems. They wanted him for intelligence purposes, and he knew that he couldn't order me to fly the mission. It was going to be my call at all. So I thought about it for a second, and I said, okay, I'll give it a shot. I'll give it a shot. But I was thinking in my head, this is really stupid. I've got a good aircraft. I got 4 crew members. I'm going to have a reporter, a Marine bodyguard, and maybe his photographer on board, and we're going out, and we're going to try to save an NVA officer who's been shot. Now, how stupid is that? Anyway, he was all for it. So I says, look, I says, Gunter, I says, this isn't really good. I says, we have a good chance of getting shot down or shot up. And he says, I don't care. I want to go along. And after I told, the photographer was there too, what I told him, well, he thought more about his own life and future than we did. And so he gave his camera to Gunter and says, you take the pictures. I'm not going along.
He wanted no part of that mission.
He didn't want any part of it. So we strapped him. We strapped the bodyguard in one hellhole, and that we call it the hellhole because it's on either side of the jet engine. And if you crash, usually transmission comes through that area and takes out one side or the other. So that's where it got the name the hellhole. So we canvas seats and then put the bodyguard, Marine bodyguard, on one side of the engine and Gunter on the other. And so we took off. And again, on every mission I was over there, I'd say just a silent prayer on our way off. I'd say for our safety and for the troops on the ground. And this time, I said even for this enemy counterpart, because he was going to be my responsibility, and I didn't want him to die before I could get him to the Special Forces Hospital in Da Nang. So, my operations guide called 2 Cobra gunships, and they were from the other side of the city, and I'd already taken off, and I was ahead of them, but they could fly faster than I could, so they caught up with us en route, and my co-pilot coordinated with them, and the infantry radio telephone operator at the pickup site. So we flew over a couple mountain ridges, and I mean, we were getting out in the real boondocks. I mean, bad area to go down in. So we crossed this last ridge, and it was the coordinates were in a really steep V-shaped valley. I mean, it was V-shaped, and there was jungle. It was all covered with jungle. But in the bottom of this valley, there was this little clearing, just one little clearing in the bottom. And so when we asked the ground guys when we were about 30 seconds out to pop a smoke so we could see where they were and tell which way the wind was blowing, they popped this red smoke. And, man, I could tell these guys it was a lousy place to get into a fight. So I told the gunships, I says, okay, you guys make a run ahead of me with your guns and rockets. And I said, I'm going to be on your tail. And then you drop me off in the landing zone, and you circle around it, and you pick me up on the way back, on my way out. And so they dove in, and all this stuff was blowing up. And so I started my approach, and usually what I do in situations like that, I wasn't like a lot of people. There's so many seconds it takes to get down from a certain altitude, and I knew how long it took once the gunship started in. So I pulled the nose straight up, and I nearly zeroed my airspeed out, and then I kicked the pedals out of trim, I bottomed the collective control, and then I started a series of, back and forth, up and down maneuvers that I hoped, the bad guys on the ground wouldn't make me that good of a target. And so we kept over our top of our friendly forces, and we started taking fire, before I even got to the LZ. But we didn't take any hits. So we got down, they threw the guy on, we took off, and Gooter's in the back taking pictures like, he was going to a movie, watching a movie house. And this guy was still bleeding bad. I don't think the guys on the ground really were that concerned about how much he was bleeding. And it was all over. He got shot in the back and the leg. And so it took us about 20 minutes to drop him off at the Special Forces Hospital in Da Nang. And I had I carried enemy troops before, but not like this, where I had to go in and get them. Usually they just put them on your aircraft and you took them back to the aid station and they took care of them. But this is the first time, I was that close to them, and you could look them in the face and really get a good picture of him. And you could hear him. He was yelling. He was hurt and he was in pain. And I realized that he felt pain just like I did, and he bled just like I did, and it was the same color as mine. And we did what we could for him, stop the bleeding before we got there, and we dropped him off. And we found out later that they operated on him, and he survived.
He survived.
Yep. So somewhere, maybe, if the guy's still alive in Vietnam, there's some old NVA officer sitting around a fire saying, you know what? All of those Americans weren't bad. He's just, he says, some of them, they put it out for us. So that made me feel kind of good.
And I got...
In the end,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
But in the end, Gunter had gotten his story, and the colonel had gotten his intelligence source, and our ground troops had gotten rid of their heavy burden. We'd gotten our patient, and our patient had gotten, medical care. And so it appeared to have been a profitable day for everyone involved. And then, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you. You sent me that article that ran in the German paper with the translation.
Yeah, it was a pretty big spread, 3-page spread. And what happened was, just before Gunter left, I told him, I said, you know what, I put in for Germany after Vietnam. And he says, if you do get to Germany, he says, write me a letter, because, I'll want to get together with you. So August, my wife and I went to Germany, and I wrote him a letter. And one weekend, he and his fiancée drove all the way from Berlin to Landstuhl, where I was stationed with the 63rd Med Detachment, and we shared a dinner, my wife and I, at our quarters on base. And it was really a remarkable and enjoyable evening. We're talking about that mission, to our wife and his fiancée. I think they thought we were crazy, but he gave us a 3-page spread, and one of the things he said was, he said the story had touched many of his readers, and even a European country. And so I guess Gunter's courage, or craziness, as my brother would say, by accompanying us on that mission, it had touched mine too. And a unique thing, he sent me a letter. It was on May 28, 1970. He sent me a letter. He says, today I sent you copies of my article about your unit and some photographs we shot on that remarkable Sunday. Sir, I have to thank you very much for the permission to accompany you on that mission. I've been a correspondent in some wars already, but the flight with you was the highlight of my career as a pressman. I'm still feeling the tension when we approached our target and went down into that horrible valley. Surely I will never forget these dramatic minutes. And then he said, well, for me, you and your men are the outstanding soldiers of the war in Vietnam. And that's not really true. the grunts on the ground were. But he said, I hope I have some success trying to tell our readers the truth about the unselfish fight of the men of the dust-off units. And he said, if you come over to Germany, as you told me, I'd be very glad to meet you and naturally to get information for another big story about the helicopter ambulances. So that's how we met up, and he came down to our place, and it was kind of a unique mission.
I tell you what, you had to have met a lot of incredible people while you were over there. Do you keep in touch with a lot of people nowadays?
Our unit has, every 2 years they have a get-together. I've had a couple of them come by my house. You know, they've had reasons to come through the Midwest, and one of the crew chiefs, he'd gotten shot down, and I went in and pulled him out, and he stopped by, and we talked about that. So he came by twice my house. The rest of them, I've talked on the phone to a number and have written to a number. So I'm in Nebraska, and most of these other guys, you know, are out in the real world, you know, on the East Coast or West Coast, and they don't venture through Nebraska that often. But yeah, we do write, and I do keep in touch with some of them. But we're old people now.
You're old now, you're saying?
We're old guys now. Yeah, a lot of them are dead. You know, many of them have died.
Well, I tell you what, I know I've got a few questions for you. I want to talk about these your animals and pets, and I've got a few other things. Do you need a break, or should we keep going?
Keep going.
All right, we're just going to keep on going. Tell me about this. Well, I tell you what, for those people, for the listeners out there that don't know, why did they call them dust-off missions? Was any evac considered a dust-off?
That you had a patient, yeah, that you were picking up patients. You know, a lot of people think that the dust-off name came from the dust our rotors blew up when we landed, you know, in dry airs, but it really didn't. It's an acronym that stands for Dedicated, Unhesitating Service to Our Fighting Forces. And, you know, that name stuck for the end of the war, and they're still using it in Iraq and Iran, and not Iran, Iraq and Afghanistan to this day. So, you know, it really stuck.
I did not know that was an acronym, and I knew that they were still using it. Thanks for that.
Yeah, you know, rather than to go into some more heavy stuff right now, you want to deal with some of the funny stuff?
Yeah, we need some humor in here, Bob.
Yeah. Well, you know, before I went to Vietnam, I published probably, I think it was 19 articles or short stories. And so, you know, I planned on being a writer, and I knew that if I survived Vietnam, that, you know, I'd have a lot of stories to tell. So I kept a notebook in my flight suit, and whenever I'd see something, or you know, something that was funny or a joke somebody would tell, or an instance that it was out of the ordinary, you know, I'd pull out my notebook and I'd write it down. And so I found out that some of the funniest stuff is written on those outhouse walls. You know,
Are we in trouble here being on the air or not?
No. These are good. And, you know, we didn't have flush toilets there. So, you know, you had 2-holers and 4-holers, and these guys would go in there and they would take out, you know, if they didn't like officers or they didn't like whatever, you could write your feelings on the outhouse wall. So I would go around, and especially at our field site at Hawk Hill, I'd check the outhouse walls, and I'd take my little notebook with me. So I got a ton of them, but I have a top 10 quote of the top 10 outhouse wall quotes.
This is fabulous.
Yeah, and what, like I said, you know, every war that our country's ever been in, you know, soldiers, they want to find something to laugh about or take their frustrations out on, and so I found the outhouse wall was one of the best. And so the first one I had was the average combat pilot, despite having a swaggering exterior, is very capable of such feelings as love, affection, intimacy, and caring. However, these feelings don't involve anyone else.
All right.
And number 2 is combat has a way of curing a soldier of happiness. Number 3, liquor to a staff officer is what acorns are to a squirrel. Love that one. We all know war is a wonderful experience, and I hope someday it catches on. As a helicopter pilot, only 2 things can happen to you, and one of them will. One day you will walk out to your helicopter knowing it's your last flight, and one day you'll walk out to your helicopter not knowing it's your last flight.
Boy, there's one.
This one's kind of cute. This is some guy wrote, Wilbur Wright, please call home immediately. I have an incredible idea. Orville. And another, number 7 was, the only thing I want out of the Army is me. Number 8, death is just nature's way of telling a helicopter pilot to watch his airspeed, and then he can only tie the world's record for flying low.
Yeah, tie it.
Number 9, the only difference between the Boy Scouts and the Army is the Boy Scouts have adult leadership. That's the great one.
Yeah.
And then number 10, war makes about as much sense as a vegetarian barbecue.
Boy.
Those are some of the things that I wrote down when I was there. And you know, we laugh about everything. You know, every chance you get, you would laugh. You try to find something to laugh about because, you know, what you had to deal with every day, you know, was so intense, and you were under such stress that you didn't matter. We did the same thing to each other. You know, it didn't matter who officers. We made fun of enlisted guys. We made fun of ourselves. It was just one of the things, you know, just to take the heat off. For a little.
Just to let a little bit of steam off. I tell you, you had a dog named Dusty.
Yeah, we did. Yeah. What happened was when I first arrived at Red Beach, there were only 2 dogs. It was Big Dusty and Jackie, and they were brother and sister. And they were Big Dusty was large. He's a white alpha male, and Jackie was smaller. And she was under our quarter-ton truck one day, and a Jeep, and somebody didn't know that she was there, and they ran over her hind quarters, and it's probably the only dog that was dusted off in Vietnam. So they flew over to the Marble Mountain Airfield on the other side of Da Nang, and they had the only veterinarian. And soon, you know, she recovered later on, but she always had kind of a distinctive limp. And you know, after I got there, it wasn't long after she was hurt that, you know, other dogs began appearing to mysteriously appear in the enlisted and officer hooches. And you know, you're dealing with 18, 19-year-old kids, and dogs, you know, a lot of them had dogs at home, and they were, you know, you could purchase them just about anywhere you wanted to go. And so these guys started bringing these dogs in. And it didn't take too long, you know, because we realized that these little 4-legged fur balls, they had a positive effect on the unit personnel. And, you know, they took care of the animals, and it was kind of a win-win situation all around because, you know, these dogs wanted to please, and there was a constant presence around, and, you know, we're just kind of like 12-year-olds. Even I was 26, 27 at that time, and we just had a field day with these dogs. So flight crews, you know, they would come back from a mission, and, you know, we smelling, you know, like the refugees from the grapes of wrath, and all these dogs would circle around us and wagging their tails, you know, and it didn't matter whether you were an officer or an enlisted guy, you know, they were licking your hand and jumping up on you. And it just really made you feel good, you know. And they didn't care whether you had rank or not. It was one of those things. So they'd taken Jackie out to the field site for a while, but then we lost so many aircraft, and everybody's getting shot up, that they brought her back and said, no, she didn't volunteer for this like us. It was too dangerous. And then towards the end of 1969, the Captain Rich Fox, he was a friend of mine. He was the operations officer before I was, and I outranked him, so I took his job when I came. And he had a nurse at the 95th Evac Hospital over on China Beach, and she gave him a gray puppy as a gift, I guess, for Christmas. And he named her Little Dusty. And this dog was a teddy bear. I mean, she was a sweetheart, and she was the friendliest of all our dogs. So he broke the rule, and he took her with him out to the field side because he wanted to bond with her. And she would sit on the radio console, and she loved to fly. And she'd look out the window, and then when they get patients, many times she would hop off the radios and run, jump in the back and cuddle up to the soldiers. It's kind of like, she knew that they were hurting.
That's pretty cool.
And you would see these, the medics told me you'd see these guys that were wounded, and they'd reach out and pet the dog, and you just helped them in that situation, and you wouldn't believe you'd come across a dog in a helicopter in Vietnam anyway. But anyway, that day we lost some more helicopters. In fact, in April of 1970, we had 16 aircraft shot up or shot down in 30 days.
Wow.
And we were only authorized 6 helicopters, so we went through our entire inventory almost 3 times. And there's, between 13 pilots. So it was kind of hectic there. So anyway, after Dusty came, another guy, he had a alternate call sign of the Mexican. He called himself the Mexican, and he had a dog he named Pachuca, and it has some Spanish connotation. I can't remember what it meant, but this little dog was a bundle of energy, and she loved to chase her tail, and she performed this crazy little dance whenever you attempted to pick her up. And her and little Dusty really got along well. So we had a rat problem there. Now, Big Dusty was kind of like the enforcer, and the rats were in our hooch ceilings or under the buildings, and these weren't rats. These were Lilliputian variety rats. These things were monsters. Some of them were as large as small cats, and as many know, they carried bubonic plague, which we'd all been inoculated against. And I'd already evacuated a number of Vietnamese civilians who had contracted this disease from the bites of fleas that these rats carried. So we had rats in the area, but Dusty was really good. I mean, he was fast and he's quick, and a rat didn't want to expose itself on the ground when he was around. So we'd look down and he would have caught a rat, and he'd walk around, and pilots would be standing around, talking. He'd come over with this rat, and he'd choose one of us, and he'd drop the rat at their feet. And I think it's kind of his way of saying, "Hey, look, I'm actually earning my keep." I don't know.
I tell you what, whatever became of Dusty?
He was still there when I left, and I don't know. The people didn't tell me. He was probably a couple years old when we were there, so I don't know what happened to him. But they always had dogs. And then right after that happened, we had a warrant officer. He came home with a pig, a Vietnamese pig, and he named it Arnold Ziffel after the famous pig, that was on the TV popular, Green Acres.
Green Acres, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember that. But,
I do.
And he was actually a she, but he still called her Arnold. And he built a fenced area for this pig behind the water tower in the officer shower where the water could drain. And during monsoon season, it was a mess, It resembled a miniature lake, of mud and sludge, and she'd get in there, and it was like hog heaven for her. So enlisted guys and this pilot, each day, they would sneak plates of food out of the mess hall to feed this pig. And as long as she was with us, I mean, she had better food than we did. And about twice a month, she would dig her way out, and you'd hear these people yelling, "Arnold's able, Arnold's able," and the dogs would be chasing this dog around the compound area until somebody caught her and put her back in her pen. But one night, just before I left, someone erected a large sign over Arnold's pen that said, "Officer Swimming Pool."
You got to get your humor where you can.
I believe we pilots laughed harder about this than these anonymous guilty enlisted culprits. You would put it up, and we still haven't figured out. I still haven't figured out to this day who it was, but my first sergeant does, and he wouldn't tell me. So later, she became so big and fat that they had to have a hog roast, but they had become too attached to her themselves, so they had to trade her for a pig with a Vietnamese that didn't have any emotional bonds to serve as a sacrifice in her place. So
they just couldn't eat Arnold.
They couldn't kill her. So to this day, when we write letters and stuff, everybody's always asking about Arnold. Do you remember Arnold, this or that? So that was my pig and dog story.
Well, I like the animal story. I gotta ask you, Bob. With all the helicopters that you lost, you had to have lost a lot of good buddies.
Our unit was not that bad. None of my guys were killed the year I was there. We had a lot of them wounded, but not dead. But the units all around us, just a lot of them were killed. And I don't know if it's prayer or what, but we were very, very fortunate with all the birds that went down and people that were wounded. None of them in that year that I was there were killed. Although they said after I left there were a few casualties, but I don't remember who they were.
I tell you what, life is strange. Just like when you're talking about some of those missions that, it's almost like a coin toss. You going to make it back or not? Bob, do you have any regrets?
No, not for going there. I have no regrets at all. I think that was a point in time in my life that I was meant to be there, and all the things that happened in my life up to that time. I think that was my place. That was what I was all about, and my problem with acrophobia. I think it's been a gift to me more than anything else, because I might not have accomplished what I have if this fear, from childhood hadn't spurred me on. And I've learned through the years. I'm 75 and a half. And I've learned through the years that to make a variety of fear as my companions, and they've stretched my understanding of life. And one of the things I've done, I've become, before I left, I was just married, and after I came back, I was more sympathetic towards others, and I'd lost my impatience regarding people who might have had their own anxieties to deal with. I call it their own little bag of rocks to pack around, because that's what I did for so long. And, it changed me in that regard. I realized how important and how wonderful, human life is. And even though we were fighting each other, you still... I wasn't a grunt on the ground facing, eyeball to eyeball like a lot of guys were. So it was probably different in their respect. But I had my mission and they had theirs. And mine was to keep as many people alive in the area that I could reach as I could. And we had a 5,000 square mile area that was our area of operation. So we covered a lot of territory. But, you after you see what I've seen, you have appreciation for life that you didn't have before. And you realize that, these guys that we were fighting, they were doing what they were told to do, just like we were told what we were told to do. And people think that they weren't good fighters. Those NVA, they were very good fighters, and the guys on the ground will tell you that too. And a lot of them were gutsy, and yes, a lot of them they get high on drugs before they would attack, one of our artillery bases and stuff. But they knew how to fight, and they were good at what they did. And it's just one of those things, They were told what they had to do, and we were told what we had to do, and we weren't running the show, so that's what it was all about.
Well, I tell you what, Bob, not only do I believe the world is a better place for what you have done, but the fact that you are a writer, you're still writing. I have pulled up to all of our listeners out there, all you have to do is Google Robert B Robeson, and you can be opened up to some of these writings. I just read one on Memorial Day that you wrote. I'm not sure when you wrote that one, but some incredible stories, some incredible thoughts.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I told a medic who I met one day, he wanted to be a writer, and he'd heard that I was a published writer, so he was a friend with one of our medics, and so my medic set up an appointment one day at landing zone Hawk Hill to talk, and so he was just a little short guy. I'm 6 foot tall, and he was probably 5'6", and probably weighed 120 pounds, and he wanted to be a writer, and we talked about writing and flying and stuff like that. And just before another mission was called in and I had to go, he looked at me and he says, "You know what?" He says, "When you get back to the world," he says, "do me a favor. Tell them what it was like here and tell them what we tried to do." And, I didn't think much about it at the time. I said, "Yeah, okay." And we shook hands and left. And it was about a week and a half later, I was in operations in Da Nang, and I got the word that this platoon this medic was in, was out. They got ambushed, and one of the guys was shot, and they had, it was a bigger force that they were up against, so they had to retreat a little bit, and he was left out in front, the guy that was wounded, and he was yelling, for a medic. And so everybody told this little guy, says, "Leave him alone. We can't, we can't risk it. We got to call in some artillery." He says, "We got to wait for some backup." He says, don't risk it. We don't want to lose a medic." And he just, from what I heard, from what the guys told me that were there, he says, "Nope." He says, "He's my friend. I got to go." And so he took off his web belt. He left his pistol behind. He just took his aid bag. And they said this guy was probably 50 yards away from him at that time. And so he either crawled or walked, or I don't know how he got out. He got back to this guy. And when they finally got back up, and they after the artillery, they went to see how they were, and they were both dead. They'd both been executed at short range, and neither one of them had a weapon at that time. And so when I got back, I remember this conversation, and I told myself I promised this guy that I was going to do what I could to tell the stories that I had the best way I could. And a lot of these guys don't have a voice anymore, and it was kind of like I was their voice, saying some of the stuff that they couldn't, and that's where it all came from. And so, in 900, you got 700. It's been 900 articles and short stories and 60 anthologies since then. I've been able to, tell these stories in different venues, and some of these articles, I have one that's been published 28 times, and it's been vetoed 48 times. So
Wow.
realize the odds on something like that. You get a lot of no's before you get a yes. But he was kind of the inspiration for me when I got back to say, I told him I was going to do it, and he gave everything he had, and so I have to give everything I have to do what I promised him to do.
Well, I tell you what, you've done a fantastic job. One of your articles has been framed in my basement for, like I say, like 40 years before I finally tried to contact you. And I remember you telling me that you don't really do interviews, and I really feel honored that you agreed to do this. I think it's been fantastic.
I appreciate that, yeah. Yeah, I'm not always too crazy about interviews because I get emotional when I deal with somebody.
I think that's I think that's one of the best parts about it. Really, people got to it's all about emotion. You talk about somebody that had it easy. I mean, I was on an aircraft carrier, for crying out loud. I was 70 miles out. So there's somebody that had it easy. I wanted to tell you one thing. Nowadays, everybody throws the word hero around way too much. I think you'd probably agree with me that hero is way overused, but I have to believe that you're a hero to those 2,533 individuals that you flew out, and you're a hero to me as well, Bob.
Well, yeah, I think we use that too much. Yeah, but we were just doing our job, and like I said, the guys that were on the ground were doing the dirty work. They're the ones I respect more than anybody. And also the Air Force guys that flew over Hanoi and had to deal with all the missiles and everything else took a lot of guts. But the guys on the ground, even the Marines, who we make fun of sometimes, even those guys, they're the grunts, and they're the ones that do the job, and they're the ones that we were trying to keep alive. And they were the kind of guys that if we went down, they would be there for us too. So it was, we took care of each other, but that was our job. And the ones that, really are the real heroes, the ones that don't have a voice anymore. And there's nothing you can do about it. We don't know if it's going to be a short time on Earth or a long time on Earth, and that's the risk that you take being a human being.
I thought one of the best things you ever wrote. It was 2 words, and it's no matter what everybody thinks about Vietnam, everybody's got an opinion. No matter what everybody thinks about war, everything else. You ended that article that was titled "Reflections of a Proud American" with 2 words: "We tried."
Yeah,
that hits home with me.
Yeah, and you know what? It was the same thing in the First World War and the Second World War in Korea. Those guys, there were people in the Second World War and the First World War in Korea that had a lot worse than we did, at least me, and I respect what they went through. And they throw this term around, the greatest generation. I don't believe that the World War II guys were just the greatest generation. I think all those guys that have gone to war is the greatest generation because they're just as brave in Iraq and Afghanistan as they were in Vietnam and Korea. It's a different world now, and you have to remember that only 0.5% of Americans right now are protecting the other 99%.
That's pretty incredible.
Yeah, and that's during Vietnam, there were a lot of people that were so scared they left our country. And you know what? I have no problem with that if they take responsibility for what they did. The risk, but a lot of them were pardoned, but the guys that died in Vietnam weren't pardoned. And so there were hard feelings on something, the old Jane Fonda type thing, there are feelings that are very hard to get over because of the way a lot of these guys were treated when they came back. And, they didn't respect us, and they didn't respect what we did and what they did to some of these guys who just got off a plane after being out in the bush, a couple of days before, and they still had the dirt of Vietnam under their fingernails. What they did to them in some airports, these low lives. You know, that is what bothers me.
Right.
If somebody's going to risk their life for you, you should respect them. And we don't make the decisions. We weren't the politicians. We did what the politicians said because that's the way our democracy is set up. And so we go where we're told, we do what we're told, and we do the best we can with it. And if we don't like it, we have to vote somebody in office, you know, on the politician side that'll hopefully do what's right. So that's where that's at. But yeah, there's a lot of guys out there that have problems, and I feel for them. And 48 years, you know, that doesn't do away with the feelings. I'll guarantee you, because the day that we die, all these thoughts are going to be there. And you know, there's not a day goes by that I don't recall a ton of these things. You know, that it flits through my mind, or something funny, you know, will happen that I recalled over there, and it's always there. It's always, you can't get rid of it. And we're not like God that can forget things. Human beings aren't like that. You remember, and sometimes it's hard to forget, you know, different things. I made mistakes, and I made one mistake in Vietnam that cost a man his life, and I never forget that. Every day that goes through my mind. I may have saved 2,500 people. I may have flown 987 missions, but one mission I screwed up. I made a bad decision, and a South Vietnamese lieutenant colonel with 7 kids died because of me. And he was a paratrooper, and he jumped out over Da Nang Harbor, and the wind caught him and took him out. And I was sitting with my aircraft running. I was about to shut down after another mission, and I saw him floating out over the harbor, and I saw a bunch of ships out there, boats, and I thought they were having an airborne thing, waterborne thing. And I should have been smarter than that. I'm not a paratrooper. I didn't realize what was going on. I was tired, and we were hungry, and my warrant officer pilot says, "Hey, maybe we better crank on the heat and go out and see what's going on." And I said, "No." I said, "We're going to have more missions coming on pretty soon because it's pretty hot, you know, south of here." And I said, "We need to get something to eat." And so I remember the parachute straight out for me. It wouldn't have taken us 30 seconds to get to him. And I shut down the throttle, and we tied down the aircraft and went and got something to eat. And the next day I find out this guy drowned. He drowned, 7 kids, and I was sitting there with an aircraft, and I think we could have got him. He might have drowned anyway, but at least we would have made an effort, and my crew chief or medic might have been able to drag him out of the drink. But I made a stupid mistake. And you know what? You never forget that.
Yeah, you know, you don't. And I tell you what, don't be too hard on yourself. Kind of like every night I sign off, I say we've all got regrets. We just got to keep our list as short as we can.
Well, yeah, I guess so. That's life.
I tell you what, just like I said, those other 2,533, they owe you. And I owe you too for coming on tonight. I tell you what, I'm going to give you a call tomorrow. We'll. I just can't thank you enough. Is there anything else you want to? Any closing thoughts? Anything else you want to throw out there before we end? I don't want to end on a down thing. Like I said, I have a number of things that are humorous, and I want to tell you about one. It was 1969, and the same Rich Fox I talked about before. He was on a mission, and what happened, they had around Hep Duck, where all bad stuff was always happening. They had some villagers that got messed up, so he was called to go out there and pick them up. Well, when you deal with Vietnamese civilians, the communication gap is really bad sometimes, and they don't always tell you how many are actually there until you get there. And so what happened was they landed, and this whole looked like a village came out, and they were packing luggage, and
Rich said he couldn't believe it. Well, they took off. Somehow he got in the air. They took off, and they had an in-flight head count, and they had 28 patients, 4 pigs, 3 chickens, and then the 4 crew members, who were already on board. And it's an aircraft designed to carry 13 people. So anyway, Rich is flying. He's flying back to Hawk Hill, and you always call your load in ahead of time so they can have litters open, and you got enough medics there that can deal with what you're bringing in. And so Charger Charger Destoff was a call sign, and they went something like this. It says, Charger Destoff. He says, this is Destoff 607, which was his call sign. He says, we have 10 Vietnamese needing open litters, 18 ambulatory, 4 pigs, and 3 chickens. And so this poor little radio operator, he acted like he sounded as if he heard wrong. He said, 607, say your last begin over. And Rich repeated his in-flight total. And he says, 607, am I understanding 4 pigs and 3 chickens? That's affirmative. There was a long pause, Rich said. And then this guy came back. He says, all right, 607, what's wrong with the pigs and chickens?
I tell you what, that was one overloaded chopper, wasn't it?
Yeah, things like that happen.
All right. It's always better to end on a note like that. But I tell you what, Bob, can't thank you enough for coming on the air with us tonight.
I appreciate it. It's nice talking to you.
All right. Well, I'll be in touch. And once again, thanks and have a pleasant evening.
Okay, you too.
All right. Bye now. Wow. I tell you what, folks, that interview went pretty long. I'm probably fired, but I got quite a bit out of it. I hope you did as well. I'm just going to throw it to, hey, I need a break. Now, Bob said he might have needed a break, but nope, he didn't want any break there. So let's just go to a song, and I'll be back shortly.